Hello, my name is Roy Young. I am first vice president of the Wild West History Association. Recently retired after 16 years as the association's journal editor. And I am going to tell you a little bit today about an Indian massacre and the capture of a young man who happens to be my great-great-uncle. I'm one of those Texans who has never lived in Texas. My ancestors were here between 1810 and 1850, 5 or 6 or more branches. Normally I talk about outlaws and lawmen and gunfighters, which is my forte, but not long ago I found that I had ancestors who were massacred and or captured by the Comanche Indians. My purpose today is not to demean the Comanches, but to simply tell the story of what was happening in Blanco County, Texas in 1867. I call this story, "Oh Tommy, Where Are You, Son?" The cry of a desperate mother over the Indian capture of her son. She was my third great-grandmother, Elizabeth Betsy Ann Crossley Tanner Huckabee. But what I want to share with you today is some of the results of her having married this new fella, William Riley Huckabee, who eventually became a Texas Ranger. And today I want to tell you about the merciless massacre of the Shepherd family and the capture of Tommy Huckabee. On the morning of July 1st or 2nd, 1867, the young family of William Irvin Nestor, as he was called, Shepherd, awakened to another hot and miserable day in South Texas. They had been preparing for a trip, packing food, water, guns, clothes, and the other necessities of primitive travel, as they were going to go to a cattle roundup of William Huckabee's. Now, the wife in this story is Huckabee's daughter by Elizabeth Ann, my third great-grandmother, and the boy is her brother, Tommy. They're traveling with Elizabeth's husband, who we'll call Nestor, and a new baby, little Joel, barely 1 year old. They're traveling by horseback and muleback. Betsy Ann is sitting side saddle, carrying little Joel in her arms. And because the trip is somewhat distant, they have to spend one night, maybe more, along the road. But as they got up on the morning of July 1st or 2nd, prepared their breakfast, got ready to make the way to the cow camp where they were going to engage in rounding up cattle, in the distance they heard many horse hooves, and they were coming rapidly. And as they looked coming through the woods, here were 40 or more Comanche Indians, warriors, all on saddle and driving more horses that they had been rustling along the way in South Blanco County. I can't describe, because I wasn't there and can hardly imagine what happened next, but William Shepherd, his wife, my Aunt Elizabeth, and their little baby were massacred, shot through with arrows, and little Joel, the baby, his head was decapitated and thrown a great distance from his body. But where's Tommy? What has happened to Tommy? There's no body. His mule is no longer there. Has he escaped? Is he in the woods? Is he dead in the grass? Or has he been captured? When the family did not arrive at the cow camp, Mr. Huckabee, as I call him, he's my third great-grandfather, being a step-grandfather, he begins to worry and goes down the trail that he knew they were coming, and about 4 miles away from my Uncle Isaac Tanner's ranch, he finds the bodies. And as any father would be, is distraught, hardly knows what to do. William has 10 arrows through his body and is scalped. His daughter Elizabeth Ann has 7 arrows through her body, one coming through her breast. She is scalped. Little Joel has been decapitated. They've been stripped of their clothing. They're lying there naked with all these arrows in their bodies. So her father, Tommy's father, arrives and sees this horrible, horrible scene. Hardly knows what to do except to go back the 4 miles to Isaac Tanner's house. Goes back to Isaac's to report what has happened. They gather up some neighbors and go to the scene of the massacre, wrap the bodies in sheets and bury them in a shallow grave. One of the neighbors, John Palmer, rounds up a posse, I'll call it, of a dozen or men to track the Comanches. And for the next 3 days, they travel over 150 miles with no sign of the Comanches, no sign of little Tommy, and give up and come back to report that nothing was found. The next question, what has happened to Tommy? Sam Tanner, another of the brothers by the first husband, rushes to his mother and other sisters to tell them what has happened. Of course, the mother is distraught, and I can just imagine the screaming and crying and all that goes along with hearing that your daughter has been massacred, your new grandbaby has been decapitated, and your youngest son is missing. So what became of Tommy Huckabee? By all reports, they could not find him after that long search by the posse, and eventually they gave up. And in some articles that made the newspaper, it was said, we never saw him again. Along come some historians and begin to dig into this story. A couple of books have been written and published by Greg Michno, M-I-C-H-N-O. Greg, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And he has come upon this story of the capture of Tommy Huckabee, and Greg has written some really good books on Indian captives. And he digs into this deeply and determines, as well as some other historians, that Tommy has become a white warrior. Within 3 or 4 years, they began to hear of a red-headed, light-skinned young man that the Kiowas, I left out this part, early on the Comanches have traded or sold Tommy to the Kiowas. And the Kiowas have named him Tehan, T-E-H-A-N, which was their word for Texan. And as Michno and other historians dig into this, and I'm digging into it now, and this is the time of the Red River War and other Indian depredations in the Texas Panhandle and on down into the Blanco and Kendall, what is Kendall County now, area. And Tommy seems to be the white warrior that they keep calling Tehan. We do not have 100% ironclad proof that that is the case, but most historians believe that yes, Tommy Huckabee became the white warrior, and he engages in all the raids and massacres and the rustling and everything else that the Kiowas were doing. Well, one day, Tehan, Tommy, is assigned the responsibility of going back to a previous camp and rounding up some horses that had gotten away. So he goes off by himself and is looking for those horses when he is spied by a small scouting party of United States Cavalry. The leader is the famous Captain Frank Baldwin, and has two other scouts at that time with him. And off in the distance, they spy what they believe to be an Indian riding along looking for something. He's so intense on what he's looking for that they're able to get within 10 yards of him before he notices them. They could readily see that this is not a blood Indian, but that this is a white boy. He's dressed as an Indian, riding without a saddle on a paint pony, all of those normal things, but he's white. So they rope him. As he's trying to take off, they manage to rope him. And they rope him around the neck. I mean, the rope goes over his head and around his neck, and they pull it tight and jerk him off of his horse. And then they begin to question him. Who are you? Where are you from? What are you doing here? Are you with the Indians? To which he answers yes to all of their questions. Now, Captain Baldwin is with the 5th Infantry. They wonder if Tehan is not a sentry or a scout looking for where the infantry, the soldiers, might be. But it so happens the reason Baldwin and his scouts are out, they're looking for a lost wagon train, which in history becomes known as Lyman's wagon train, Willis Lyman. A number of books and articles have been written about this. And so they capture Tehan, and they take him to Lyman's wagon train, which they have spotted another great distance away from them. And there they turn Tehan over to Willis Lyman, and this is a military wagon train that had gone after supplies and are on their way back to Camp Supply in the Oklahoma Panhandle. As the days go by, terrible rainstorms overtake them, and they're unable to make any distance in a day. And one morning they wake up, and here come 400 Kiowa Indians charging toward the wagon train, the supply wagon train. They form a circle, as you see in so many Western movies, and the Indians ride around in the traditional way, shooting guns, firing arrows. And in the midst of this, they spot Tehan, Tommy, with a rope around his neck. And they go back and report that to the Kiowa leaders. The wagon train has now run out of water. Their barrels are empty. And only because it has rained are there some places where they can go for water, and they must sneak away to do this. Tommy Tehan has now endeared himself because he's a white boy and is telling them his story, and they loosen the rope from around his neck for the first time, and he pretends that he's going to go with them to get water, but instead he is able to get on a horse and sneak away and go back to his Indian family. And they're thrilled. They rejoice. They have little ceremonies of happiness. And they ask him, Tehan, why didn't you stay with your own people? And he says, you are my people. And that kind of breaks my heart. But he has now been fully acclimated into the tribe. And subsequently, as I've said, he engages in all the activities that an Indian warrior does. We hear of him at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. We hear of him at Camp Supply. And one old Comanche told the story of Tehan coming into his camp one night and returning to the Comanches for a period of time. They go to New Mexico and other places. And about this time, they hear of the capture of the Kiowas and the Comanches, including Geronimo and his people. And Tommy's, Tihan's adopted father is part of that group that has been taken to Fort Marion in Alabama. Soon they hear of his death. Tihan begins to wonder, where is my foster mother? Word comes that she's at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And the last we ever hear of Tihan is that he's going to Fort Sill to find his foster mother and take care of her. Other sightings are recorded in history that may or not be Tihan. And in fact, there may be more than one Tihan, because that name means Texan. But at this point, we lose all track of Tommy Tihan, and his end is totally unknown. Several years ago, a Canadian movie company got hold of the story, and they filmed a movie called The Dream Keeper. You can find this on several websites. He's portrayed by an actor named Scott Grimes. And from talking to a cousin of mine last night who has now been able to view this movie, there's a lot of things in it that are just not based on fact, as movies often are. But I'm glad to know that someone is still keeping up with Tihan, Tommy, my uncle. And that's the story of the massacre and the capture of Tommy Huckabee.
Okay, Roy, let me ask you one question.
All right.
I know you are not going to let this just lie, that you're going to pursue it. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
And you've got several people that are going to help you out, and the more you hear about it, the more you're going to have to help you out. So I think now, and let me get one thing straight, when they were coming from the Lockhart area, were they going to Tanner's or Huckabee's?
To Tanner's, because Mr. Huckabee was already at the cow camp, which is at Isaac Tanner's.
Okay, so that's what we're looking for now, basically, is if we can find the location of the Tanner property, we might could backtrack and hopefully discover something.
Yes, exactly. We know where the Tanner property was. We know where the Huckabee property was, way over on the other side of the county. But he maintained two households, one in Lockhart, Caldwell County, and one in Blanco County in the little community of Middleton. So there's some misunderstanding between me and my cousins as to whether they were coming from Lockhart or coming from the property in Blanco County. But anyway, they had gotten to within about 4 miles of Isaac Tanner's property where the massacre occurred. And several of us met with the Blanco County Historical Commission this last week, and I named some of the ranchers whose horses were stolen on the same day, or I'll say rustled. Over 100 were rustled from 5 or 6 different ranchers. And some of the ladies on the Blanco County Historical Commission immediately recognized those names and knew where they lived. So we now have a pretty good idea where the trail is, and it's reported that the massacre was 4 miles east of Isaac Tanner's place, so we're beginning to narrow in on where this massacre took place.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much.
Thank you. My honor.